Hello everyone, Rabbi Jacobson here. Welcome to Wednesday Night Live with yours truly. And tonight's class is Does Your Job Define Your Identity? Dedicated in loving memory of Shirley Faye Tesler, Faye Gebat Alexander, and Naomi Leah, a sister of a very dear friend who just unfortunately, tragically, prematurely passed away last week. So our heart goes out to their family, Becky, the entire family, who's listening to this from overseas. And may the words that we share here, the words of Torah, which are spiritual words and soulful words and flaming words, help the soul reach the place of peace that it should reach. So, as a small introduction, I've always emphasized, there are many Torah classes. Torah classes have been going on since the beginning of time. Jews have been gathering since the time of Moses studying Torah. And you're probably familiar that the Torah has many levels of interpretation. You just open up a Chumash, you open up a Parsha, and you'll find layers upon layers of commentary, Rashi and Ramban and Even Ezra, etc., etc. And then there's commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries. I don't even know how many levels, but it's many levels. Long before the World Wide Web, anyone studying Talmud or studying biblical commentary was already trained to think in that type of hyperlink way where everything connects with everything, and it's just one big intricate maze that is fascinating and is really the body of Jewish scholarship over the years, which we call in the broad stroke Torah. Now, each week of the year, which corresponds to 52 weeks, we have 52 chapters, and every chapter breaks into 7 parts. So, in effect, we have for every day of the year a corresponding section of the Torah. And as you know, Jewish tradition, we read the Torah every week on Shabbos. But Moses decreed, just like Ein Mayim Ela Torah, there's water and Torah are equated with one another. Just like a person can't go 3 days without water, we don't go 3 days without Torah. So we have a Torah reading at least every 3 days: Monday, Thursday, and then Shabbos. This week's chapter is Shelach. This is the fourth chapter, I should say, of the book of Numbers, of the 4th book of the Torah. So as I said, many Torah classes and that discuss the detailed commentaries and the different counter-arguments and understanding, interpreting different verses. Then, of course, there's the entire Talmud, which elaborates on the Torah. And as you know, there are 4 different levels of interpretation of Torah: Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod, which is the literal, the allegorical, and the homiletic, and the esoteric. What I emphasize here in this class, which began how many years ago? It's 20s when you were here. It began 1982, the winter of 82. That would be, 32 years ago. Yes, we were all younger men, younger women. And there was no internet then, and there was no email, there was no fax. I still was using a typewriter back in 1982. You remember a typewriter? Yeah. And so the world has changed, at least the technology world. Emotionally, psychologically, nothing has really changed. We still deal with the same issues, maybe just amplified today. It's a broadcast. So back then, so what I've always done, the underlying theme of this class has always been to discuss not the intricate commentaries, which has much value, but rather the ultimate, which is the application of Torah to our lives. Because I feel, and I've emphasized this all the time, that the biggest challenge we have today as Jews is to make Judaism relevant, to experience it as a relevant message. With all the traffic out there, with all the competition for our attention and for our investment, it's even more important that the Torah be relevant. And unfortunately, we find a dissonance. Whether when someone grew up in Orthodox or grew up in observant life, they may have Judaism part of their nature, part of their culture, part of their upbringing, but it could be very mechanical. Mechanical doesn't necessarily mean it resonates and spiritually dynamic and full of vitality and passion. Now, most people reserve their passion for making money, finding honor, for other interests, indulgences, pleasures, sexuality, and so on. And then there's the larger segment of the Jewish population which are assimilated. And they definitely don't find relevance in Judaism. So relevance is the operative word that I would submit is a critical component in maintaining and perpetuating Judaism and its legacy. Because without something being alive, it ultimately dies. Same as with relationships. There are times you have to go into automatic pilot, but if your entire journey is an automatic pilot, you've got a problem. And relationships, just a loving relationship, is something that's a work in progress that has to constantly be worked on, because things that are just are left alone become stale and they become static. And life is about mobility and movement. And something that doesn't grow, if you're not busy being born, as they say, you're busy dying. And definitely the case in our relationship with God and our relationship with our souls. And the irony is this: a soul, by definition, is just pure passion and energy. That's what soul means. Say something is soulful. It's passion. So the emphasis I place in this class is to focus on the soul dimension of how to make these ideas, these stories, the narrative relevant. Because you can read the entire Torah and be a master of every commentary and have no clue what relevance it has to your life. And I'm sure you'll meet scholars that are in that category. So the emphasis is relevance, personal application, how this speaks to our hearts, our souls, psychologically, emotionally, how it addresses the issues we struggle with. Which that will at least get a person's attention to say, oh, here's an issue I'm struggling with. You're telling me the Torah has an answer? That's fascinating. But if we're going to try to get people's attention when they have all kinds of struggles, they're going to therapy for this or for that, struggling with their own demons, fears, real or imagined, and you ask them to give me a little attention, I got to tell you a message from Judaism and Torah. So yeah, they may out of conscience, out of guilt, or Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur once a week, give you a little attention. But if you make it relevant, and you demonstrate its relevance, I should say, not make it relevant, demonstrate its relevance, that's a whole different story. You're telling me it talks about the issues I'm dealing with already, that's a whole different picture. And I personally struggled with this. I grew up in a very traditional Jewish home, and often I saw in my schooling and my people around me that it was very mechanical. Beautiful people, a lot of good things. I don't have no negative experiences, but I've always wondered about that relevant thing. And it's when I began to study the so-called mystical, the Hasidic, the Kabbalistic, the soulful dimension of Torah, that's when it became alive. That's when it became like music that really can resonates and relevant to our lives. So I want to address something in this week's chapter that is extremely relevant, and that's titled the class, Are You Defined, Is Your Identity Defined by Your Job? The fact of the matter is, statistically speaking, most of our adult lives are spent working. Most of our adults spent working. Most of the day, is, let's say, 9 to 5 job, whether it's an 8 to 10 job, whether it's 90 hours a week, is spent at your job, in your career. At home, you're there in the morning, you're there in the evening, barely at times, and often exhausted after a long day, etc. So one has to wonder, what happens to our identity? Does your job become your identity? Or another way of putting it is your self-worth defined by your net worth? Because job is not just a job. A job is involved with expectations. A job is involved in responsibilities and pressures and demands. And this one wants that, and this one, whether it's an employee or it's an employee. It's a whole an undertaking. It's a whole life. It's interesting, if you study the history of work, quote unquote work, you'll find that in the earlier ages, in the earlier generations, work was seen as a menial, a demeaning thing to do. The philosopher kings of the Greek culture, or in other cultures, were the people who were involved with ideas, and people who were in the labor were the laborers. They were the slaves. They were the servants. But the optimal was not to work. Work became a so-called more deified, if you could put it that way, by the Calvinists, by John Calvin, a strain of Protestantism, which is what we call the Protestant work ethic, where work became a way of serving God. If you look in the Bible, actually, work is a curse. I'll explain what I mean by work. I don't mean work as in achieving things. Work as in the hard labor that we exert, the sweat of our brow. What does it say? After Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, and Eve. So Eve was punished. Well, Judaism, crime and reward and punishment should be seen as cause and effect. Okay, it's another misnomer, another stereotype. So what do you have? You have is that Adam was told, from now on you will have to earn your bread. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your bread. Had he not eaten from the tree of knowledge, the bread would not have to, he wouldn't have to toil in the fields. And he could spend most of his time studying, praying, learning, growing spiritually, and so on. So work was not always seen as the center of our lives. Even the Europeans today, especially the French, like to say that Americans live to work, and they Europeans work to live. The question is, what the living is about. You can work to live. It depends what is your life about. So, bottom line is, however we understand the history of it, the fact of the matter today is work is a reality of our lives. Not only a reality, a dominant reality. And for many, it's seen as their shining, what shall I say, their source of pride. Many people feel much more successful at work than at home. People whose marriages are failing, or don't have a good relationship with their children. At work, at least, they're excelling. In many ways, work is a lot easier because it doesn't require the same emotional investment and doesn't expose all the vulnerabilities and all the other stuff that's exposed at home. So we'll talk about this some more. But there's no question that this issue of how we deal with work, with career, is a major impact on who you are. So in our formative years, in a healthier environment, you should be growing up in a home where your parents provide for you, so you can explore the world, you can explore knowledge. Our education years, first as children, then as young adults, teenagers, young adults, until we're thrust in, whether it's mid-20s, when we leave college, when we're thrust into the world of work where we have to start earning on our own. Until that point, there's a certain measure of idealism, a certain element of lack of being jaded. You've not yet been exposed to the corruption, the pollution of the world, to greed, to the competition. I don't know if you remember the first time you got exposed to it. It's pretty shocking the first time. Because as children, or even as young adults, there's a certain sense of, as I said, idealism, a certain sense of adventure. You trust. And the first time that trust is breached, through disappointment, through a lie, through backstabbing, first one is shocked, and then it becomes something, you become used to it, and then you realize, hey, that's the world. I lived in fantasy land. The truth is, as we shall soon discuss, the fact that everybody, in some way, not everybody, but that we live in a corrupt business world should not necessarily mean that the world is that way. It means people are that way. But there's that shift that we come to. And it's probably hard to identify when we all shifted over. When we shifted over, where we learned that if you want to survive, you got to swim with the sharks, as they say. Dog eats dog. So with that, all that said, work begins to become a force that identifies us. It becomes a force that becomes a component that takes control of our lives. And then at some point, we wake up and ask ourselves, well, hopefully we wake up and ask ourselves, why are we working? So working to make money. Money is security. So you can have security, so then you can do the things that you really want to do. You can provide for your family, so they can all do what they have to do, want to do. But honestly, does that ever really happen? Or does work start becoming an end in itself? And what is it that you want to do anyway? What defines your ideals? If you never really took time to develop those ideals, and work became so much part of your life, by the time you're ready to retire or you're ready to leave the rat race, the question is, what have you left? Where is your soul? What has happened to it? So these questions are all addressed very directly in this week's chapter. Surprisingly, because you could say the events of this chapter happened thousands of years ago. And what relevance could it have to a contemporary world with the struggles we have? I just want to add, when I say work, I don't just mean work labor. Work means basically the things we're preoccupied with. The means. So here we have a chapter that discusses this in a very direct way. And in general, as we shall soon discuss, philosophically speaking, if you look at the different philosophies of the world, even though I don't want to be too generic, there are generally three attitudes to work. Two attitudes, and then the third one we'll discuss here. One is if you take the Eastern approach, when I say Eastern religions, Eastern disciplines, like Buddhism and its variations, you'll find that the ultimate nirvana, the ultimate experience of truth, is when a person does not take their material preoccupation so seriously. So I'm not talking now about China. I'm talking more India and Tibet and that area. China has its own story because it also began with Confucianism and so on, and because of its communist side of it, has its own imbalance there between work and its own soul, so to speak. So their attitude is, if you want to preserve your soul, you want to save your soul, you want to preserve your own integrity, you cannot get caught up too much in this rat race of greed and competition, because it kills souls, basically. I'm not necessarily using exact words, and that's why the ultimate life is a monastic lifestyle, or sometimes called asceticism. Trying to live a simple life. The simple life. This is Eastern. Not all Eastern, but many of the Eastern thought. In the West, what developed, as I mentioned, with Calvinism, and then ultimately like America, the United States. The United States was always the worship of work, the worship of the dollar. No one worked as hard as Americans did. That was a staple of this country. Free opportunity, equal opportunity, but you have to work hard, and you can achieve great things. Here, it took on, and this is if you go back to the philosophers Hegel and the development of capitalism. So most people think capitalism began as an economic approach. No, economics actually was an outgrowth of a philosophical approach, of religious thinking, because they were struggling with, what do you do with money? How does it fit in? So if you look at the early capitalists, Adam Smith, and the sources of his information material come from philosophers, Weber and others, who developed the concept of how we look at work and so on. So their attitude was more immerse in the world and find a way to maintain a ethical a work ethic that and through that we serve God. That was the roots of how it was looked at. Very different than the East. It was immersion and trying to preserve an element of integrity and ethics and morality. In the last few years, we've seen, as some have argued, that capitalism is coming to its end, because it's proven that it doesn't work. Because once people get greedy, and they become focused purely on the money, they lose that ethic. And the only thing you really have to rely on are the watchdogs. Now, what happens when those oversight entities become corrupt as well? Which is how they describe 2008, the crashes in the financial markets and the financial firms, and the banks and the mortgages. Because money, the almighty dollar, becomes a golden idol, and that people, if they can get away with it, are going to get away with all kinds of stuff. And for every one that was caught, there's another 30 that haven't been caught or more. But nobody wants to talk about it too openly, because if you talk too openly, then the whole trust system will fall apart. And then, at the end of the day, it's all psychological. If we don't trust the people who are supposed to manage it, and ultimately the United States, if you read, you'll see nobody could afford the United States going bankrupt. It's just too many collateral damage will be too overwhelming. So there becomes this vicious cycle of maintaining a certain sense of illusion of that there's trust on top and there's integrity and so on. Now, I'm not suggesting it's all corrupt through and through. I'm just suggesting that those that know how to manipulate it, there's nothing what will stop them. Their faith, they're going to regulate themselves. So many argue that it really, at the end of the day, is coming to its end. It has to implode at some point. If it hasn't yet, a little more time, etc., etc. So many of Adam Smith's and capitalist theory has been put to the test many times over. Not to mention, frankly, that there is no such thing as raw capitalism. It's been affected seriously by socialism in the sense there'd be no unions, there'd be no workers' rights, minimum wage, equal opportunity, etc., had it not been for socialist thought seeping into the capitalist system. It's still a capitalist system in the sense of private property and profits and so on. But it's not the hardcore capitalism as it was in the 18th century. And Marxism, for all its flaws, Marx had many strong arguments exposing what he called the alienation that was caused by a capitalist system. The alienation from worker to worker, boss to worker, alienation from worker to the product, etc., which is very true. If you look at the world, especially the very heavy corporate world, there's no real loyalty. Loyalty is based on results. And if there's no results, the most loyal worker stops producing, they're out. Yeah, good. We have today, you have severance packages, you have ways to protect, but it's still at the end of the day, if it comes down to if you don't produce the right amount, even if that last year you did, there's playing workers against each other. Ask anyone who works in the financial firms, they'll tell you what happens. And people's souls do get murdered. I don't say murdered because there's always hope, but there's a lot of compromise to people's integrity. And it's a fact of reality. I'm not trying to paint a bad picture, I'm just trying to paint a realistic picture. Because let's put it this way, without a strong compass and a strong navigational, let's call it the spiritual GPS, the winds and the powers of finance, money, and the power that it brings are too strong and overwhelming for most of us. I'd say for all of us. So the question is, how do you deal with it? That's why the Eastern thinkers felt the best way is avoiding it. Don't worship materialism, and that way your spirituality will thrive. The Western world felt more, let's figure out a way to make it work. What does Judaism have to say about this? And remember, Judaism precedes both schools of thought. So this week's chapter has a lot to tell us about this. What's the story? The story is Moses is sending the scouts to Israel. The Jews are traveling in the wilderness, and Moses, before they enter the promised land, Moses sends scouts to scout out the land, as the Ramban, Nachmanides writes, in order to see what's the best way to enter, what's the best way to conquer this land. And the scouts come back, however, with a terrible report. They come back, even though, as Rashi says, even though at the time they were sent, they were pure of intent, they were kosher, so to speak. They were actually the leaders of their tribes, of their respective tribes. They come back with a terrible report. They come back, and in 3 words, they capture everything I just said till now. They say, it's Eretz Eichelet Yeshveha. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. They traveled there, they saw these giants, they saw the powerful regiments, they saw powerful fortresses. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. These 3 words, if you think about it, are eternal. Anyone who enters the workplace at some point feels that way. This land consumes its inhabitants. I go in with good intention, I go in with integrity, and then the land, meaning the marketplace, consumes its inhabitants. And the scouts said, therefore, let's not enter this promised land. Not only that, they instigated an entire nation to cry and to weep and to bemoan the fact, what are we doing in this wilderness? It was much more comfortable back in Egypt. Where are we being led into this land that we're going to be destroyed and be consumed? Which of course begs the obvious question, what's going on here? Every Jew knew then. They had received the Torah. They spent 210 years in a hell of Egypt. They knew that throughout the Torah you have the promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. You're going to enter Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land, the Promised Land, the land that I have promised. How many times do we say it in our prayers, in the Torah? The land that I promised for our patriarchs. And suddenly the scouts, who were not small people. It's a land that suddenly become terrified. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's die in the wilderness. What is that? What kind of language is that? Where's all the trust? God led them till here. And they saw miracles. What's happening? And the answer is because when they saw it, when they saw the world of the material world with their own eyes, their faith was shaken. Till now it was all promises. Now they saw the real material world. Imagine them walking in to a Madoff Ponzi scheme or to Wall Street corruption, and they say, this is where we're going. And they lost their courage. On a deeper level, the mystics explained that the Meraglim were very spiritual people. Why would they want to go into a land that they have to struggle with this whole corruption and the pollution of a material world? So actually their claim was not because of their lack of faith. Their claim was, why do we go into this inferior? They were basically arguing asceticism. Let us live here in the wilderness. Let us find a base medrash, a kollel, where we insulate ourselves from the material world, and then we'll serve God. What's the grave sin? The grave sin, no one asked you. No one asked you whether we could do it or not. It would be the equivalent of someone saying, I give up on life. I'll commit suicide, God forbid. I'll throw in the towel. No one asked you. God sent you. Al karcha chatachai, the Mishnah says. You're compelled to live. Yes, a soul sees this earth. It doesn't want to enter this world. Who would want to enter a world like this with all the pains and the suffering and the inhumanities? Imagine you're a soul in heaven, and God says to you, listen, my friend, it's time for you to go down to this world. You look down and say, let me take a look. You look at the world, you see what's going on here. You say, who would want to leave a spiritual habitat where everything is so protected? Why would you want to enter this world? As a matter of fact, in Hasidic literature it says, why does a baby cry, right, when it enters this world, leaves its mother's womb? It cries because it suddenly sees the world it's entering and saying goodbye to the world it's coming from. And there's a lot to cry about when you do that. As a matter of fact, there's an argument in the Talmud between Shammai and Hillel, classic argument. The argument goes like this. Nuach la'odam shenivra or shalei nivra? Is it more pleasant for a person to be created, to be born, or not to be born? It's an interesting argument, a Talmudic argument. Hillel says it's more pleasant to be born for all the things we can achieve in this world. Shammai says it's more pleasant not to be born. Why? Because this world has more pain, has a lot of pain and injustice and inhumanity. It's much easier to live a soul without a body. It's interesting, even though the halachic, the legal ruling is usually according to Hillel, in this case, it rules according to Shammai. And the Baal HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe, says an unbelievable line. He says, so if that's the case, so why are we born? If it's more pleasant not to be born, and that's the ruling, we should stay, anyone was born. He says, because pleasant, it's more pleasant not to be born, but it's more purposeful to be born. So pleasant, yes, it's much more comfortable in the siesta of the heaven, sitting in Gan Eden, where you could sit and study Torah all day. There's no Yetzer Hara, there's no illness, there's no death, there's no disease, there's no competition, there's no greed, there's nothing, none of that. So it's a beautiful honeymoon, and much more pleasant, but purposeful. This is the purpose of existence: to enter a world that's not comfortable and make it a comfortable world. There was just recently passed away a chassid. His name was Rabbi Zalman Posner. So I knew him. He was a scholar, a writer. He once told me an interesting story. When he was a student in yeshiva, this was in Chabad, back in the 1940s. So the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe had then come to America in 1940. So this, I think, in 1946 or 47, he called in this Rabbi Zalman Posner, who was then a bocher. He was a bocher in yeshiva, 70-year-old student. He says, I want to send you on a mission to Chicago, I think it was, to go speak to Jews about Judaism, teach, and so on. And it was not like 1947. This wasn't done on a daily basis. It was a leap. So the Rebbe sends, Zalman Posner tells me the Rebbe sends that I was hesitant, I was tentative. And then he told me the following. He said the Rebbe then had suffered a stroke. This was the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak was his name. He had suffered a stroke, so it was difficult for him to speak and difficult to understand. So he would use his hands And part of understanding was a lot of his using of his hands. So he said, you have to watch his hands as he spoke. He said, the Rebbe said to me the following, using his hands. He says, when a soul has to come down, he spoke in Yiddish. He said, when a soul has to come down to earth, the Rebbe said, it doesn't want to go. Why doesn't it want to go? Because in heaven, it's varim and lichtig. It's warm and bright. And down below in this world, it's kalt and finster, cold and dark. So why would a soul want to go from a warm, bright place to a cold and dark place? Would you want to know it? So the Rebbe raised his hand and said, what do? How do they get a neshama, a soul, to go from there to here? So he said, the Rebbe took his hand. He told me, he took his hand like this. And he said, but they tell the soul, Hashem tells the soul, you have to go. He started making with his hand, you have to go from a place where it's bright and warm. And he made like he says his hand was like shaking a bit, going down, 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 like that, to a place where it's dark and cold. And there, you have to make, where it's dark and cold, illuminate and warm that environment. That was all he said. So Reb Zalman said he understood the message quite well. He went off to Chicago, did what he had to do. He later became a rabbi for many years in Nashville, Tennessee. Listen to this. He said every time he had difficulties. Who doesn't have difficulties in life? We all have our challenges. We have our times, our down times. He says he remembers the Rebbe's finger, the trembling finger, saying that a soul doesn't want to go down from a dark and cold place to a warm and bright place. But it's told you have to go down. And he says he would feel like the finger is leading him down and helping him down here where it's dark and cold to make varim, lichtig and varim, bright and warm. It's not necessarily something you haven't heard before, but it captures it in very vivid terms. And this is what the scouts resisted. They didn't want to deal with a corrupt Wall Street. They didn't want to deal with the challenges. They wanted to stay in Kollel. They wanted to stay in yeshiva. They wanted to stay in their mother's womb. They wanted to stay in the ark. All the different metaphors you want to give. But that's not the purpose. It's more pleasant, but not the purpose. So the question then is, so how do we deal with the challenge? As I said before, the fact is it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. No one ever negated that statement that they said. But if you read of the scouts, 10 of them were all caught up in this conspiracy called Dibas Haaretz, the Lashon Hara, the bad mouthing of Israel. But 2 were not, Joshua and Kolov. And Kolov says an interesting expression when he responds. He says, when after the scouts incite, he says, no, Allah Naila Yochel Tuchel, we can do it. Say it twice, we can do it twice. We can enter that land. And Allah Naila, therefore, let us go up and let us go up. Let us climb and ascend and conquer Israel. And Kolov's words captures the essence of Jewish thought. Well, first of all, what does Kolov mean when he says that double expression? The exact words are so as I said, the scouts had said Eretz Echel Sheshvel. Right. And Kolov said, "Vayas Kolov esa'am al Moshe v'yemer ol enayla v'yirash neisha ki yochel nuchala." Double, pice double. We should ol enayla. We shall ascend and ascend, go up, and we can take possession of the land. That's what they said. And the scouts said, "Lei nuchal lalis ki ala'am ki chazuku mimenu." So here therein lies the whole issue. To capture the power of these words and the whole philosophy here. So I gave the background earlier about work, what role work plays in history and so on and so forth. It really comes down to how we look at the material universe. When the Buddhists and the Far Eastern thinkers talk about the universe, so one of the key underlying principles is that the material world is either an illusion or a superficial reality that we have to learn to ignore in order to discover the light, so to speak, the truths within. There are even books today that demonstrate the fascinating parallels between that thought and quantum mechanics. I don't know if you ever heard of a very popular book years ago called The Tao of Physics by a Harvard physicist who changed his name to Fridtjof Capra. But he was an American physicist, and he wrote a very fascinating book on the parallels of Far Eastern thought and quantum mechanics, modern physics, all emphasizing that element, that what we see, the surface level of existence, is exactly that. It's a superficial, either illusion, or at best a superficial layer. That beneath it, the real truths lie beneath the surface, which are all unifying forces as opposed to fragmentation. But the illusion is so powerful that it takes hold of all of us. And unless you learn to see through the curtain, what one of the radical bands of the 60s called the Doors, they took their name from William Blake's poem called To Cleanse the Doors of Perception. That's where the name of the group comes from. But if you cleanse the doors of perception, Blake writes, you'll see reality for what it is. Oneness. Whether Blake came to that realization through natural means or unnatural is not sure, but the doors definitely didn't come to it through natural psychedelics and so on. And so this is a common understanding today of anyone that studies physics, and especially the spiritual side of things, that the reality of spirituality is an inner unity that the fragmented surface of the universe conceals. You want to get beyond that surface, you have to give up some of it, or else it'll take hold of you. It seduces us. And therefore, as I said before, work is seen as something, do menial labor, do a minimal amount of labor, but your focus has to be on the light, on connecting to the light. Very much like the Meraglim. That's what the scouts argued. A land that consumes its inhabitants. We enter Israel, we will be consumed by it. You enter Wall Street, you enter the marketplace, you can't do it. On a subtle level, this was actually what the patriarchs were occupied with. It says in Sfarim, why were they Reish Tzayin? Why were they shepherds? Why were they shepherds? Because tending to sheep is a very relatively non-intense labor. Sheep graze in the meadows. They're more or less docile. They're domesticated. And meanwhile, the patriarchs could spend time in the meadows and the fields meditating, contemplating on existence, on God, praying. Instead of being involved in the real hoo-ha, they say, of Elam Haza, Havle Ha'elam, which is the real involvement in the negotiations and the cutthroat business world, it's a relatively spiritual type of labor. But it is labor, so you can make a living from it, but it's a... And this was Abraham was a shepherd, Isaac was one. He was also well digging a little, and Jacob was a shepherd. That's what he did. 20 years he tended to the sheep of Lavan. Whole parsha just about sheep. Then comes Joseph, and he's also a shepherd until he's 17. When does things change? When Joseph, due to the jealousy of the brothers, they sell him into slavery. Okay. The story goes that he went out to see them tending to their sheep, right? And then they throw him into a pit, about to kill him. Instead, they sell him into slavery. What happens next? He becomes the first Jewish accountant. It says he becomes Potiphar. He becomes Cheshvei Cheshbenis. That's what the Targum Onkelos says. Cheshvei Cheshbenis. He's a bookkeeper and accountant of Potiphar's coffers. And then he becomes, of course, the viceroy after he interprets the dream and turns Egypt into a superpower, dealing and trading with grain, which was then the commodity of the time, turned Egypt into a superpower. So Joseph is the first businessman that came out of Abraham's children and grandchildren. And here's the chiddush, here's the thing. What happens after 22 years when he reunites with his brothers? And Jacob finds out his son is alive. What's the first thing? Joseph sends back a message. Tell my father that about the agolas, about the chariots, about the wagons. So Rashi in the commentary say, what's this about the chariots? the wagons. That Agola was a hint to the Egla Arufa. Egla Arufa is how do we translate Egla Arufa? It was the offering brought in a situation, whatever, it's a whole law. Egla Arufa, when someone's found murdered in between two cities, the closest city has to bring a kapara, a offering, because they are responsible, even though not directly responsible, but they're responsible for anyone that was killed in their vicinity. So he says, tell my father that was the last thing him and I studied 22 years ago. When Jacob heard that after 22 years, despite the fact that Joseph was thrown into the business world, still remembered that Torah, he realized that the integrity of Joseph was not compromised. And it says in the books, the holy books, that Joseph was greater than the patriarchs because they lived an ascetic lifestyle. They were shepherds, and that's how they preserved their spirituality. Joseph was in a world ervas ha'aretz, in a perverse land, and dealing with the real harsh and perverse business world, and still maintained his integrity. That's a far harder accomplishment. The Seder Hayom, it's a book from one of the middle-aged scholars. I've mentioned it a number of times here. He explains the Gemara in Brachos. In Brachos it says, tractate Brachos, it says, Le'elam yehei adam zayir b'tfilas hamincha. A person should always be careful, especially careful with the mincha prayer, the afternoon, second prayer of the day. Ki Eliyahu le'nana el tfilas hamincha. Because Eliyahu's requests were answered but tfilas hamincha, not the other two prayers. So mincha has the time of mincha, zman mincha. It says the time of mincha, the prayer of mincha has a special power the other two prayers don't have. Obvious question, what do you mean? Mincha is, if anything, not that you can say one is inferior to the other. Mincha is the shortest prayer, it doesn't have Shema. The morning prayer is the major one. The evening prayer, at least, they say Shema. So why is mincha so special? The Seder Hayom writes, the reason I just described. Because morning prayers and evening prayers are said before and after the work day. So, okay, before you go to work, after you finish work. Especially in those days, Shas, that's how it was. Mincha was always the middle of the day. Middle of the day, that you rip yourself away, you tear yourself away from your work and your involvement in work. Masa matan ba'amuna, faithful work. And you can think about God. That to be in the business world and remember God is a far greater achievement than before you go into the business world or afterwards. So this is the challenge, and this is ultimately the beauty of Judaism. You have Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes. Tiferes is the hardest one of all three. Why? Because you're entering a world, a material world, and yet you still find a deeper unity there. The Rambam brings at the end of Laws of Chanukah that the entire Torah was given to bring peace to this world. What's peace? Shalom. Shalom is not the absence of war. Shalom is a whole entity. It means wholesomeness. It means completion. It means taking two forces that on their own are not just diverse but divisive and finding a middle ground. Shnei ksuvim machishim zeh zeh, two verses that contradict. Because the third verse comes and reconciles. That's far harder. It's easy to be a single person in this world. It's hard to be in a marriage. Because two opposites, man and woman, who have disagreements, and yet they find shalom bayis, they find shalom. That's a far deeper accomplishment. And that's the purpose of existence. The Meraglim wanted the easy way out. They wanted to separate themselves. And Kolov and Yeshua, and what God ultimately wants is, no, I want you to go into a land. Yes, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants, or potentially can, and I want you to make sure you consume it instead of it consuming you. How is that possible? That's the big question. To use more philosophical terms, matter and spirit are fundamentally at odds with each other. They are dichotomous. There's a tension between matter and spirit. Just look at our lives. To focus on material gain, and at the same time to be a spiritually refined person doesn't go easily together. Because here you have to be cutthroat, you have to be tough, and so on. And the other is all about being refined, being edel, being giving, and so on. If a person is going to be like that in the business world, they'll be taken advantage of. So how do you relieve the tension, the inherent tension between matter and spirit is the real question. So I mentioned before, the Protestant ethic is you enter the world and you figure out some kind of compromise. Basically compartmentalization. The Far Eastern way of thinking is you have to avoid the material and try to be as ascetic and as so-called separate from, like what in Judaism would be called prushim. Prushim. But Judaism, what does Judaism teach? So this brings us to the real answer. I'll start with a story, two stories. There was Binyamin Kletzker, was a chassid of the, I think that was Binyamin Kletzker, it was Mordechai Kletzker. He was a businessman, but he was a chassid in the times of the Baal HaTanya. And he was once sitting and making cheshbonos. He was calculating his business. Binyamin Kletzker. Binyamin Kletzker, yeah. What did I say?
I'm not sure if it's Mordechai.
No, I said Binyamin Kletzker. I said Binyamin. Yeah, Kletzker from the word klotz. He dealt with wood. And he was making his calculations. So, you make income expenses by month. Tishrei, Cheshvan, or January, February. And he wrote, every day, here are the income of this month, the expenses of the month, and the balance. The deficit or plus and minus. Profit and loss statement. He went through every month. Then he came to Elul, or December, the end of the year, the fiscal year, and instead of writing a number, he wrote something else. He wrote, Ein Eid Milvadeh. There's nothing but God. So the question that's asked is, if he's so aware of the omnipresence of the divine, then how did he have the presence of mind to write numbers on each line? On every line he should have written January equals God, Ein Eid Milvadeh, February Ein Eid Milvadeh. The answer is obvious. If he did that, he doesn't belong in business. He has to have accountability. He belongs in a yeshiva. He's a batlin. Doesn't belong in business. He absolutely was a good businessman. He knew his business. But when it came to the total, the real total, he realized money is not just money. The total is God. He knew how to keep the balance. Most people can't maintain that type of presence of mind. Once you're in it, you get consumed by it. If not to get consumed, I have to avoid the whole thing. Judaism asks us that type of nimna ha-nimnoyes, which is basically paradox, to be able to do both. A second story, there was a chassid, who was once a very diligent student and a person very involved in Avodas Hashem and all of that. And later he went into the business of galoshes manufacturing. He became very wealthy. One day he comes back to his Rebbe. His Rebbe gives one look at his face and sees where his head is at. He says to him, Fissen galoshen ab gezen, aber a kop in galoshen. Feet in galoshes I've seen, but I've never seen a head in galoshes. His whole head, his whole being was immersed in the galoshes. That's what his answer was. So there's an expression that when you do malacha avodah, you should do b'lei lev v'lev. You ever hear the expression b'lei lev v'lev? Without a heart and with a heart. You have to always, in Judaism, the goal is to keep your feet firmly planted on the ground. Yes, we have to know where we are. We're not naive. We have to know we live in a material world. But where's your head? In the clouds. Ein of lamata, ein of lamayla. You have to be able to, ein of lamata rather, and liba lamayla. You have to look down and know there's a world. I remember this once, the Rebbe once said it by Farbrengen at the end of the Sechta Tainus, Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av is called the Jewish Sadie Hawkins Day. Shidduchim Day. So it says there that the maidens of Jerusalem or Israel go out and they greet the young men. This is courtship. And they use an expression, Bocher sanoi enecha. Bocher, young man, raise your eyes and look at me. So when you read it, what does it mean? That a bocher on his own doesn't look up. He's always not looking down, he's humble. But when it comes to Meshidduch, you have to look up, you have to see the person you're going to marry. So this is life. Life is a constant balance. It's not like, you get yourself too comfortable in this world. You have to always maintain an element of not being that comfortable. But at the same time, this is the place where God wants us to illuminate the world. So what does it come down to? So I'll tell you, when I was writing Torah Meaning for Life, it's a number of years ago, it's almost 19 years ago. And I remember the first draft I wrote Remember, it's taken from material that was in original Yiddish and Hebrew and Torah. So when you have to write it in English and make it very contemporary and make it very relevant to an audience that does not necessarily know the original Hebrew and the context and so on, it's not an easy thing to do. Because if you over-translate it, you lose the original, the integrity. If you under-translate it, people won't understand what you're talking about. So I remember the first draft I wrote a chapter, and something bothered me terribly when reading my own chapter. I just didn't like it. It sounded too like psychobabble, too much like another self-help book. And I remember I was really disturbed because, I thought, I may not be able to pull this off. And I was really panicking. I remember a colleague of mine walked in and saw that I was bothered. He said, "What's bothering you?" So I said, "I just read my own chapter. I don't like what I'm writing. It doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel truthful. It feels like, too diluted." So he gave me very practical advice, which I did. He said, "Why don't you sit down? I'm sure it's not all bad. You did write it after all. Why don't you write down on a piece of paper all the problems you have with it and then go line by line and fix them?" It's a good idea, divide and conquer. That's what I did. I still have the document. I found 103 problems with the chapter. And then I proceeded to go ahead and correct them. There were some small problems, but there were also big ones. And two main things jumped out at me, which, I had an epiphany. Because, when you write in English, as I said, you have to really digest the ideas and then regurgitate them in a new way, and while maintaining the original spirit of the written. So it's not a small effort, as I mentioned. But I remember two key things. In schools of mysticism, what makes Jewish mysticism different than every other school of mysticism is this: that you can achieve more through an action than through a meditation. Maiso Iker remains the cardinal rule, even for the most mystical. And don't think it's a small statement, because when you're mystical and spiritual, you travel away from action. You move into the world of thought, imagination, creativity, you're dreaming. Good dreams. You go into the world of light. And action is antithetical, because action is grounding and defining and limited. Action is an action. I could spend time meditating on love and compassion. Well, I don't have time to go give a penny to a poor person. So it has a certain antithetical element to it. So Judaism says, no, maiso iker. You got to go down while you're going up. It makes much more sense that you're going up or in. You should be going away from the world of action. So that was one thing I realized that was missing. That it's not just about going up, it's about also knowing how to ground it. Like I said, feet in galoshes, yes, you need feet in galoshes. Your head has to remain above. But if your feet is above, it's also not good. Your feet need to be in galoshes. And the second thing that I came to realize is, this was even more important, was that God is not spirituality. There's a material world, there's a spiritual world, and then there's a godly reality. When we say kedusha, holiness is not just spiritual. Because spiritual can also be arrogant. I know people who are very spiritual, and they're very arrogant spiritual people. They see themselves superior to materialistic people. Spirituality can still be about you. It's more sublime. Materialistic is more coarse and more selfish maybe, but it's still about you. And Kedusha is about submission and surrender, bittul, about something higher than you. So I realized that it can't just be writing about how to become more spiritual. I have to write how to become more godly. And I changed the whole tone of the book, where I focused on two extremes. To become godly, not just spiritual. Not that spirituality is a way to God, but it's not the end. And grounding it in this world. That was the key two things. And you will not find that in other philosophies. Because as a matter of fact, and I've talked to many people who are experts, and they say, no, it's correct. Because it seems almost contradictory. You're going up. Why are you going down? And that's Judaism. Judaism says the mitzvah of a maisa, even if you don't have kavanah, has sometimes more power than all the intentions. Now, obviously, there are mitzvahs where kavanah is liikuva, which means intention is vital, and without the intention, the action means nothing. But especially when it comes to karbanos, offerings, or prayer, and so on. But for example, charity. Interesting. Charity is a very interesting example. Charity is the most extreme. Charity, the Rambam says there are 10 levels of charity. But the most basic is simply going and helping someone materially, with let's say, a few pennies, a few coins. However, what's better than that is by also smiling to him, mafaise, to saying a kind word. You could do it in a sour face, you still get the mitzvah. But the mafaise is even greater. And then he goes on, anonymous charity, that the one who gives doesn't know who he's giving to, the one who's getting doesn't know who he's receiving, all the way to the highest level actually is a loan, which preserves the dignity of the recipient, etc. But there's an interesting sifri that says the following. I think actually it's on this parsha, not sure, somewhere in Bamidbar. Says, what happens, hama'avet selah? You lose a coin in the street. And a poor person picks it up and goes, buys a piece of food and then sustains themselves. And here's the catch. And the person who lost the coin, had he known that someone found it, he was not miyayish, he did not give up on it, and he would want it back. He wouldn't want the pauper to use it. I want the money back in his mind. He doesn't know because it was lost. So the Sifri says he still gets the mitzvah tzedakah, even though had he known he would have said no. Because the action was performed. It doesn't make a difference what your intention is. Even if your intention is the opposite, it's still the action. That's how powerful charity is. Charity doesn't need any kavanah. Not to say that intention doesn't add. Like I said, there's levels. But just to show you how important it is. The bottom line, the person was sustained. That's why charity also, it says, is the only mitzvah where God says, test me with this. Where you can say, nowhere does it say in the Torah that you should test God. And say, if I'll do this mitzvah, I want my child to live. You don't make deals with God. It's not appropriate. It's not respectful. When it comes to charity, God says, no problem. Give charity in order that my child shall live. Test me with that. Because you give life to someone else, I will give you life. I'm not saying necessarily it's the optimal way to serve God. But why? Because action is so powerful. But let's not suggest that action alone is enough. Action, as I said before, could be mechanical too. Mechanical Judaism. That's why you need the soul. Bottom line, what's a healthy person? A healthy soul and a healthy body. So when people ask the question, people have asked me, why is it so important to be a good Jew at heart? I'll be a good Jew at heart. Why do I have to do the act? So I don't think anyone's a businessman, doesn't have to be a businessman, knows. Let's say you go into an investor, a potential investor, VC, and you make a presentation, and the guy says to you, I love your idea, I'm going to share it with everyone, I'm going to tell, it's beautiful, and of course you get so excited by that, you leave, and you never got anything signed. The dotted line, the check, what's the bottom line? Nothing happened. My heart's with you, everything is great. If you don't get the Maisa Iker, if you didn't sign a check, all this is meaningless. I think it was Ariel Sharon, Prime Minister of Israel, who was a general in the wars. So he was once by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the Rebbe that was then encouraging, especially in the army in Israel, to put on tefillin on all the soldiers. That in addition to their so-called material strength, tefillin, Yorokol Amei Aretz, that it also adds in spiritual strength. So he said to the Rebbe, tefillin, we could think about tefillin. Who says we have to put it on? So the Rebbe smiled and said to him, let me ask you something. For a person who trains soldiers, I find that quite surprising. What happens if your soldiers tell you, we can think about military exercises? Why do we have to actually train? Because that's how it is, my friends. In this world, we live in a material world. You need material training. You can't just sit and meditate on it. You have to go out there and train and train and train. And many soldiers will train, and many armies will train an entire lifetime for one battle, which may take a relatively short time. Because you need the action, you need the Ma'aseh B'Peil. The Mezuzah Magid, the Baal Shem Tov's great student, a great Rebbe of his own, once was visited by an old friend of his. When they were young, they studied Kabbalah together, and they grew up together. So this old Kali comes, he sees the Magid of Mezuzah. Everyone finished davening Shachar this morning, prayers. And the Magid continued to daven. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, a half hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So he waited respectfully. After he finishes, he goes over to his friends, Shalom Aleichem. They were old friends. He says, but I have to understand something. We grew up together. We studied the same yeshiva. We studied the same kavanas and everything, how to pray. It takes me an hour. 4 hours of prayer. What are you doing there? So his answer was, he says, and what do you do today? So his friend says, today I basically, I study, I learn, I daven. But for parnasa, for income, what I do is I travel to Leipzig. Leipzig was like the big marketplace in those years. I spend 2 months there, where I buy material from the merchants, and then I bring it back home. And my wife and family, they sell it throughout the year. So that's how we have a livelihood. So the Maggid says, 2 months? You spent 2 months in Leipzig? He says, yeah, 2 months. Why do you have to travel and spend 2 months? Why don't you just sit home and meditate about Leipzig? Meditate how you bought the material. Meditate how you came back. And meditate how you sold it. So his Chaver says, Maggid, is that a batlan? How do you translate a batlan? You're out of touch. I need the scheda. I need the material. I was going to help me sitting in my home meditate on the material. I need the scheda. I have to go to Leipzig. So the Maggid looked at him and said, that's why I spent 3-4 hours davening. I need the scheda. It's not about just the material. I need to go on a journey to go get what I need. And that takes time. So there's two sides to the coin. And one is, we enter a land that on its own consumes its inhabitants. But at the same time, you keep your head always in the clouds. Now this is a great challenge. This is very difficult. But that's what it is. And if you look at the Jewish calendar, and the Jewish day even, you wake up in the morning, say prayers, you study something, or the whatever order. This is meant to fortify a human being before they go out into the battlefield of a land that consumes its inhabitants. It's not meant to be a little lip service. You do a little mechanical davening, a little mechanical. It's meant to fortify your soul, to know you're going into the world in order to elevate it. Not you're going to the world because you're a worker. Your identity is your soul. Then you go into work because that's the purpose. That's where God wants you to go. But never think that's your identity. It's not your identity. Your feet don't belong in galoshes. And then the end of the day, or mincha, and then end of the day, you reconnect that same thing. Shabbos once a week is the same concept. All of Judaism is this tension and resolution at all times. This rotzeh and shuv. You enter, but not too much. You enter in order to elevate. So how do you ultimately relieve the tension between matter and spirit? That's what I said before. Because God is neither matter nor spirit. This is the beauty of Judaism. God is not closer to heaven than he is to earth. Even though everyone would say that is. God's in heaven and we're on earth. Right? Say Shemaim nitna Hashem v'aretz nasan l'bnei Adam. That's what most people think, but that's a duality. That's God may be more comfortable in heaven in the sense because heaven is more conducive. The angels, the souls. But God is not spiritual. God is a dimension that's beyond spiritual and material, and that's why in the material you can find as much spirituality that you can find in the soul. When I discussed the class before, the pre-Shavuos class, the original E equals mc squared, what Einstein discovered, that energy and matter are reversible, are really the same thing, is the essence of Jewish thought. It's only in our eyes that energy and matter look like two forces. Matter is energy. However, it's trapped. So it says in the Midrashim that it says before Matan Torah, there was a gzera, there was a decree, a schism. Gzera can be two meanings, a decree and a schism. Between Elyanim, it says that which was above did not come down below, that which was below did not go up above. Basically, matter could not be turned into soul. To use the language of the Reb Chaim Brisker, to turn something into a chefetz shel kedusha, to take a chefetz of chayil, which means a piece of matter that belongs to the material world, and turn it into a holy object, not just used for holy ends, but the thing itself should become holy. That was not possible before Matan Torah. For Matan Torah, there was no such thing as transforming anything that's material. which explains, some of the Achreinim explain, that's the reason that when Abraham sent his servant to go find a bride for Yitzchak, so he made him take a shvuah, b'nikitas chayfetz. He made him take hold of something that was on Abraham's body, where he circumcised himself. So everyone says that's not sneezdik thing to do. It's not a modest thing to do, because that was the only mitzvah before Matan Torah that actually changed the physical world that can be used as a chayfetz of kedusha. Nothing else was that way. After Matan Torah, we have the power to transform matter into energy, and that's the essence, because the divine lies in matter as much as in energy. God does not exist more Yom Kippur in a synagogue than he exists in the middle of a Wednesday on Fifth Avenue. It's more conducive, obviously, on a Yom Kippur or in a synagogue or in a holy place. But one second, there's only Hashem Echad, there's no two gods. So it's easier for us. But from God's perspective, why should the material world be less godly than the spiritual world? However, it's more difficult, because it's far more difficult to find spirit in a place where you're dealing with corruption and pollution and everything else I described. But the ultimate objective is to transform the material into the spiritual, to combine, to fuse matter and energy. So what does it come down to? When you have an attitude like that, then your identity is your soul. You're sent into this world, and you're made to forget about the soul. We learned the entire Torah in our mother's womb, we're made to forget. And then the rest of life, the rest is history. We usually get consumed by this world. Eretz Echeles Yeshva. The Meraglim couldn't say it better. Till this day we have this problem. This land consumes its inhabitants. You see it every day, again and again. But it's not meant to do that, and that's what Kolov said. Ola Nala, because the truth is, in this material world lies trapped, in the words of the Kabbalists, sparks of the divine sparks, waiting to be released, but they're trapped in the tentacles of material life. The wisdom we have to have is not to be seduced and not to be deceived into thinking we are our jobs, we are the work we do. You have to always remember that's not you. Even though you spend most of the time maybe at work, that's not you. That's what you do. There's who you are, and there's what we do. Unfortunately, most people, who we are, our identities become what we do. You ask somebody, who are you? They give you their business card. They identify. That's how they identify. I say, is that who you are? Is that what you do? As a matter of fact, most people, what they do is not even what you want to do. Most people actually hate their jobs. The statistics show. Most also figure out to start liking something you hate. That also happens. If a rare person you're going to find that actually loves what they do because it's an expression of my soul's mission in this world. That's a gift to find, to make the ability to realize your dreams while also making a parnasa, making a living. Ask most people what jobs they do. They say, what were you? I was an arts major. I was an artist. I was a musician. I was this, I was that. Not everybody. How'd you get here? Well, there's no money there. And you may think it's just a small matter. It's not. You end up becoming a product of your actions. So you end up becoming not who you are. And I don't know if there's anyone on this earth that doesn't have this problem in some way. Because we live in a world with the pressures, the demands, the expectations. And then, of course, simple habit. The inertia of habit starts defining you. You become something else. So you say, what's the big thing? Well, the first big thing is that you may just simply have wandered away from the purpose of your existence. So that, I think, is a pretty big thing. You end up living your whole life, and you find out, I never fulfilled why I was here, sent here. Now, some people justify that by saying, maybe I wasn't sent here, maybe there's no purpose. Okay, if that makes you feel more comfortable, then fine. But if you start thinking about things, and you do believe there's a purpose and there's a life, and your soul didn't just come here by accident, you have to think, okay, why am I here? Am I here to do my job? No, you're here to do a job. In your work, you're there to refine and elevate the sparks and the matter in your job. That's fine, but not your job is meant to refine you. You're meant to refine your job. It's a very big difference. There's a difference in addiction and control. Addiction means the object controls you. Our work can control us and identify us. Or the other way around. Now, I don't really know how a person can really achieve this on their own, because this world is a very powerful world. That's why we have a Mishnah that says in Pirkei Avot, Ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha esek b'Torah. There's no one that's free except one that's diligently studies Torah. It's an interesting Mishnah. What does that mean? Many people say, what do you mean? I know a lot of free people that don't study Torah. I know a lot of people who study Torah that are not free. It's true. So first of all, the Mishnah doesn't say, Kol misha esek b'Torah ben chayrin. It doesn't say that. It says you cannot be free unless you study Torah. Why? Because Torah is the only system that's not man-made. You see, anything you study is part of the human condition. And as Einstein and other thinkers say, you cannot change a system from within a system. Torah is from outside the system, so it can make you free. It frees you from the tentacles and the shackles of material worship, of worshiping the golden calf, whether it's literally money, power, the forces that you think give you value, and so on. It's recognizing that your value is not based on your productivity and buying power and youth and status and equity, but it's based on your soul fulfilling its mission in this world. Now that's the thing we have to hold on for our dear lives. When you study Torah, you know what happens? It helps take your head into the clouds and not let it end up in the galoshes. So it's a force. Ein chavish mater esatzmei. A person who's in shackles, a person in fetters cannot free themselves. When you're tied up, you can't untie yourself. When you're in a deep pit without a ladder, someone has to throw you a rope. So Torah is like that rope. It like gives you fresh air of another perspective. You have your perspective of how you see the world, how you see people, how you see business, and so on. And the Torah says, no, there's a higher standard. It gives you a way to look at the world through God's eyes, not through your own eyes. And that's what brings freedom. Now, many people study Torah in a very mechanical way or a very academic way or whatever, so it doesn't necessarily bring freedom. But without it, you can't achieve true freedom. So that's, my friends, the story. The Meragli made the mistake, and B'chila Deris came out of that. Tears for the ages, for the generations. But there were two people who didn't. And we are here as a people because we knew how to balance the two. As difficult as it is, it's immersing in this world but never becoming part of it. It's entering but remaining above. It's a difficult one. Because, as I said, far easier to just be above, and that's that. Or to just indulge and be overcome by the realities down below. That effort to be able to be there and be above is the greatest challenge. And you'll see the greatest people you meet have that sparkle, have that ability, that as much as they've seen in this world, how much as non-naive as they may be, because they've seen the difficulties and the pains and sufferings, they still maintain an innocence of a child. You ever meet people like that? They're very rare. Because most people who are very pure, because they probably didn't see the real pains of life. People who've seen the pains of life get very hardened, very jaded, very cynical. There are people who are able to have gone through the most difficult times of life and still maintain an element of enchantment. They still maintain innocence and hope and optimism. Is rare, but it's people who have that combination. So check out, try to find such people. Those are the best of all. Because they have both worlds. They know, they have experience, they're seasoned, they're not naive, they're not pushovers, but they maintain a connection to something that does that, whatever this world does not ultimately corrupt them. That's a very unique combination. The Meraglim wanted to separate themselves. Korach, in next week's chapter, wanted to immerse himself. We'll talk about that. And the rest of us are somewhere in between. So, with that said, I'd like to conclude that each of us have this challenge. Each of us are in this material world. It's not an easy life. And you need to have many what they call, when they throw you a life rafts. There you go, a life preserver. And the more the merrier, because as many signposts as we have, the material world is still very powerful. You could be very inspired and very stimulated, but then you walk down the street or something else happens and you're thrown for a loop and you're right back into the whirlpool of material life. So it's a challenge that we have to continuously fight. And one of the best ways is to commit to something, especially with another person, whether it's study or prayer or something that's spiritual, that keeps you always above the fray, even while you're in it. So may everyone of us figure out the right formula to balance the two. And remember, your identity is not your work. Your work should be an extension of your identity, not the other way around. And maintain the integrity of your real soul. Okay. Again, I want to conclude with the class being dedicated to, loving memory, sadly, of Shirley Faye Tesler, Fega Bat Alexander, and Naomi Leah. May her soul found peace after her difficult life. A young woman passed away just last week. Good friend of our friends here. And may we only celebrate Simchas together. And until next Wednesday, I bid you all a very good week. Philip will be giving his next week's class. If you haven't left your email address with us, please do so. Stay in touch, and I send out a weekly email. I'll be happy to send to anyone. And any other way that I can be of assistance, or the Meaningful Life Center can be of assistance in your spiritual/material journey, please be in touch, and I'll try to be helpful in any possible way. So everyone have a very good week.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.